Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Welcome to our Thursday evening webinar. I just want to welcome all of you who have joined me this evening. As always, I trust we have been having a great week, and I look forward to the time we spend together in studying this evening. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate all of you. So we're going to go ahead and start with prayer as always. So I would invite you all to just bow your heads with me where you are. Let's pray. 1 second, that's my wife. Jen,
Oh, you start your thing,
I'm
man?
just started.
I'm sorry. We can't get the hose to work there.
Turn on the pump.
We turn on the pump and no water not coming here.
My apologies, guys. All right, let's pray. We thank you, Father, for the blessing of being able to meet together this afternoon to study your word. Once again, we want to tell you thanks for the understanding you give us week after week as we come to share in looking at the things that you have preserved for us. You know our limitations, you know that we are prone to make mistakes, and so I want to commit our meeting into your hand this evening. Pray that you will take charge and direct us according to your wisdom. As we thank you, Father, in Jesus' name, amen. All right, let me just turn on my fan. I think I will need it. Okay, last week we were looking at the priesthood of Christ being of the order of Melchizedek. And what we have been doing for the past few weeks is really looking at some of the types of the Old Testament and to see how they are fulfilled in the experience of the New Testament church. Now I want to step aside from that a little bit this week, and I want to spend our time this afternoon looking at the prophecy in Matthew chapter 24. Now you might be wondering, how is this related to what we have been looking at? Well, it's not exactly the same, but it's very similar in that what we are going to look at in Matthew 24 is a prophecy. One prophecy that covers maybe 2 or 3 different ages. And I want us to look at this because I want us to get a clear picture in our mind that many times we look at, especially the prophecies of the Old Testament, but not always the Old Testament, because this is actually something that Jesus himself gave, and it's recorded in the New Testament. But many of these prophecies, they have more than one fulfillment. They are written, they are given in such a way that they have a fulfillment in the time of the people who heard it, and they have another fulfillment in another age, in another time. If you don't understand this, like many people, you might come to the conclusion that some of these prophecies are unreliable. But once you understand this principle, then you have a tool that will enable you to look at other prophecies of the same nature, and you can understand them better. And you will also be able to see the deeper wisdom that is behind the way the Bible is constructed. So, as I said, we are going to be focusing on the prophecy of Matthew chapter 24. All right? Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so Matthew chapter 24 is where we are. In verse 1 it says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." So, they come to show Jesus the temple. I guess he's from Galilee. He's like almost, I guess you'd say he's a country boy. He has come to the city. I suppose that's the only reason why they are showing him the temple. Because I guess they're assuming that he has never really paid attention to the magnificence of these buildings before. But anyway, they come to show him. And then Jesus uses the opportunity to give one of the great prophecies of the Bible. Well, first of all, he says, you're admiring the temple, you are looking at all these things, but I'm telling you, there's not going to be left here one stone upon another that is not going to be thrown down. So he prophesies the destruction of the temple, the complete destruction. In verse 3, it says, "And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world?" That's a very interesting question that they're asking. It's interesting because it seems like they have an understanding that he's going to go away and come back. As you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you get an idea that the disciples are very confused about what's going to happen to Jesus. Even at the end, when he dies on the cross, they are very surprised, very caught by surprise. When he's taken prisoner, they are caught by surprise. But I suppose at this time, he has already told them, I'm going to go away and come again. If you read John chapter 14, you see where he tells them, I will go away and come again. So I guess they got that in their minds. And so when he tells them about the temple being thrown down, they come to him quietly when the crowd is gone and they say, Tell us. And they say, Tell us. You say the temple is going to be destroyed. When is this going to be? And so they attach another question. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? So one thing you can tell from this question is the disciples had a pretty good understanding of two things. Number one, Jesus was going to come again, and number two, that would mark the end of the world. Now I know that sometimes when you see the phrase the end of the world, especially in the New Testament, sometimes the proper translation is the end of the age, the end of this era, the end of this age. So I didn't take the time to look at it to see if that's exactly what it means. As a matter of fact, I could look at it just as a matter of curiosity, the end of the world. What word is used in the Greek? G165, and it means it's aeon, and it says properly it's an age. By implication, it means the world. And in the Jewish usage, it really means a messianic period. So, yeah, it's kind of like I said, it's a word that means the end of the age, because I don't think they had a concept of the end of the world in the same way that we understand the end of the world. At that point, the understanding that the world is going to be destroyed by fire and all the rest of it, I don't think they had a clear understanding yet. So they're talking about the end of the age. They recognize that since Jesus is the Messiah, There's going to be a changing of, there's going to be a new dispensation, there's going to be a new age, we might say. And this age under which they were living would come to an end. So some great change would take place. I think, they expected that the kingdom of Israel would be exalted above the nations. That was their concept of this new age. So they come to Jesus. They say, look, he's telling us that the temple is going to be thrown down. This has to be the end of the world. And so they come and say, tell us, what you mentioned this coming of the end of the world. You mentioned the temple being thrown down. When will it be? And what is going to be the sign? So they ask two questions. When will it happen? Number one. And number two, what will be the sign? What sign can we look for to tell us that you're about to come back? These two questions. So bear that in mind, because we are going to be looking now at the answer of Jesus. And in verse 4, it says, and Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. The first thing he tells them is that they should be careful. He suggests that there's going to be deception, and he tells them to be careful because they don't want to be deceived. In verse 5 he says, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Now, if you have never studied this chapter before, and you read it for the first time, it can be very confusing. Many times you hear people talk about, what do we see to make us understand that we are living in the end of the world? And they will use a verse like this. You shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. But look at what it says at the end of the verse. It says, the end is not yet. In other words, when Jesus spoke about these wars and rumors of wars, he was not saying that they were a sign of the end. He was actually saying they were a sign that the end had not yet arrived. So many times people use this verse and they actually twist it to say something different than what Jesus meant to say. Because Jesus says, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be disturbed, because even though these things will come to pass, the end is not yet. Now, the first thing I want to point out here is that Jesus was answering the first question that the disciples asked. Remember the first question? When shall these things be? Which things? Remember, he told them that the temple would be cast down and not one stone would be left upon another. So they asked him, when shall these things be? And he's going to answer that question. So if you look at this passage and you hear what Jesus is saying, remember he's answering the question, when will the temple be destroyed? So what we see here, many will come in my name saying, I am Christ. This is referring to what happened before the destruction of Jerusalem. And when it says you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, this was referring to what happened before Jerusalem was destroyed. These are not statements that apply to the end of the world. So we should take a note of that. Yes, there are wars and rumors of wars taking place in the world now. But when Jesus spoke of it, he was not speaking about our time. He was speaking about the time just before the destruction of Jerusalem. And we will see that. We will see that. Now, were there false Christs and false prophets? I mean, we know that today there are many people who are claiming to be Christ. If you do a search on Google, I think it was Brother Howard who in one of his presentations said he did some kind of search and he found about 8 of them. I think there are really a lot more, but there were about 8 very prominent, very outstanding ones who had millions of followers in the world today who claim to be Christ. So, this is true. But again, when Jesus gave the prophecy, he was talking about false Christs in the time of the apostles, in the time of the apostolic church. You remember that, I don't know if you remember, when Paul was arrested, they accused him of being, I think somebody named Theudas, was the name Theudas. They accused him of being somebody who went and led 400 people into the wilderness. And this person apparently was somebody who was claiming to be the Messiah. And the Romans, all of them perished. The Romans wiped out all of them. It's true that round about the time that Jesus came, and subsequently, there were several people who came along claiming to be the Messiah. Because, you know, the Messiah was a figure that was looked for in the Jewish religion. They were looking for the Messiah. And of course, if you rejected Christ, what they were looking for was a warrior to lead them against the Romans. That's what they believed the Messiah would be. Somebody like maybe David or Samson or Gideon, some of these men who were outstanding warriors. They certainly didn't look for a man who was going to be hanged upon a cross. So anyway, Jesus tells his disciples, though, he says that be careful that nobody deceives you, because he knows people are going to come along claiming to be the Messiah. So then he says, you'll hear of wars. And they did hear of wars because the Romans came and attacked the city. The Romans made war against the Jews. And I suppose they made war against other nations too. Now, also, in verse 7, he says, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. And again, these are things that people always use as evidence of the end of the world. But Jesus says, all these are the beginnings of sorrows. And again, we have to understand he was speaking about a time before the destruction of Jerusalem. And you will see that in a moment. So while it is true that we have these things happening today in an unprecedented way, Jesus' first meaning was that these things would happen in the days of the early church, in the days of just before the destruction of Jerusalem. So the best we can say about these statements is that they have a second application. In other words, what happened just before Jerusalem was destroyed, the similar events will happen again at the end of time on a greater scale. That's the way we can apply these particular statements to our time. But remember that the first meaning what Jesus was Jesus answering his disciples, what shall be the sign? When will these things happen? When will the temple be destroyed? That was the first question he was answering. So we can conclude that in the days of the apostles, there were wars and rumors of wars. Nations were making war against other nations. And there were famines. There were pestilences and earthquakes in different places. And there were also false Christs. Very similar to what is happening today. But maybe not on as great a scale. Maybe today, of course today we are seeing it on a greater scale, because now we are not dealing with a little localized area like Palestine. We are dealing with a globe, the entire planet. So, of course, there's a lot more going on a bigger scale in our days. But Jesus said, referring to the early church, when all these things were happening, all these are the beginning of sorrows. He goes on to say, then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. Was this true? Of course it was true. The first of the church, the first person in the church who was killed for the sake of Jesus was Stephen. They stoned him to death, but they followed up quickly. Not long afterwards, they took James, the brother of John, and Herod beheaded him. And there were other people, I mean, all of the apostles were martyred. And there were many Christians who were killed by the Jews, some of them by the Romans. But Jesus said it would happen for my name's sake. In other words, these people were killed not because they were criminals or hooligans, not because they created insurrection or led in protests or marches. They were killed because they preached Jesus. There was a hatred kindled against the name of Christ. And anybody who used that name became a target. So Jesus warned them. They will deliver you up to be afflicted, and they shall kill you. In verse 10 he says, and then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. So Jesus speaks of this more than once. I think in Matthew chapter 10, he said something similar. He says, a man's foes, a man's enemies, will be they of his own household. So, he's giving his disciples here a graphic illustration, a graphic description of what they can expect to happen because they have chosen to follow him. And he's not giving them a rosy picture at all. It's going to be very difficult. When he says in verse 10 here that we are looking at, then shall many be offended. The word offended, I believe it's from a Greek word which means they will be made to stumble. Let me see. Right, from the word scandalon, which means to trip up. To stumble, to trip, to stumble. So, and of course, what he's saying is that they will be made to trip because many shall be offended. Christianity will become a stumbling block to them. They will stumble over Christianity. And as a result, they begin to betray one another and they will hate one another. So, we have not experienced that on a significant level in our time. Yes, I know that many of us have been perhaps disfellowshipped, put out of our churches. Maybe our family members find us somewhat strange and they don't talk to us as closely as they could. But there's nothing like what Jesus says here, where the people betray one another, because there's no death sentence on Christianity today. Christians are not in the Western world at any rate. Maybe in some Islamic countries and like India, where Hinduism is very strong. Maybe in these places you have these things happening. But certainly in the West, Christianity is not at that place yet, where people begin to betray one another, family members, close friends, and people stumble and turn away from the faith because of the persecution they are facing. But it was happening in the days of the early church. And this is primarily what Jesus was focusing on. In verse 11 he says, and many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. He says it again, not just false Christ now, but also false prophets. And he says, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall grow cold, shall wax cold. So, it's an interesting statement that he makes here. It's an interesting principle that where there is abounding iniquity, where wickedness becomes deeply entrenched and it becomes strong, then many people will begin to grow cold in their love for Christ. Even genuine Christians, their love grows cold. Why? Because they are enveloped in the spirit of what is prevailing on earth. Okay, even in our day, even though, as I'm saying, I don't believe that the first meaning of this passage is to focus on our day, but even then, what do we call abounding iniquity? I mean, I'm thinking of, it's not the murder rate in society. That's not what is making people grow cold. That's not what is making Christians grow cold. It's not the murder rate. It's not the stealing and the raping and similar things. These are not the things that are making Christians grow cold, making their love grow cold. In fact, these things would make Christians become stronger because it would make them pray more. It would give them a greater sense of the need to stay with Christ. So what kind of iniquity are we talking about? We're talking about the kind of iniquity that might appeal to even Christians, like, the movies and television and, widespread opportunities to view pornography and to be involved in things like that. Opportunities to in the world today, to change your sex, to indulge in all kinds of perversion, all kinds of, moral perversions, things that appeal to the lower nature. These would become so abundant. And because these become so widely accepted in society, then the love of many Christians begin to grow cold. That's what Jesus was saying. So, but at the same time, remember that I believe that he was speaking primarily of his day. Well, just after he went back to heaven, the early church and the experience they would have. So, as we say, history repeats itself. It's the same thing happening again, but this time it's happening on a greater scale. But it's useful for us to remember that the first time Jesus said it, the first application, it was applying to people who were living at that time and listening to him. So we will see why that is important as we proceed. And then he says, but he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. What is the end? What is the end, and who is it that shall be saved? Again, see, he says in verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. Now, interestingly, let me see if I can find the reference. There is a place where the Apostle Paul says the gospel had been preached in all the world. Let me see if I can locate it. Here's one verse in Colossians 1, verse 23. Here it is. Look at what Paul says. Colossians 1 and verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. It says the gospel was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. Let me see what the King James Version says. Which was preached to every creature which is under heaven. Was preached to every creature which is under heaven. That's what the Apostle Paul said. Now, was this really true? I'm sure that it wasn't true in places like Australia or North America or South America. I'm pretty sure. Parts of Africa. I'm pretty sure that there were places in the world that had not yet been exposed to Christianity, because people who lived in the Western world, in the biblical world, they had no knowledge of those other countries. But as far as Paul knew, and as far as his understanding of the world went, the gospel had been preached everywhere. And maybe he was maybe exaggerating a little when he said it was preached to every creature which is under heaven. Maybe there was a bit of what do they call it, hyperbole? Yeah, a way of just speaking in a general way, with slight exaggeration. But at least they understood that the gospel was to be preached to every creature. That's what Jesus had said, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. And so here in Colossians, Paul was saying that it had been done. So, I'm making the point because when I go back to Matthew 24 and verse 14, what we see is that Jesus says this would happen before the end would come. And if you think about the question the disciples asked, when shall these things be? They were connecting the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. And Jesus says, before the end of the world comes, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world. Now, from what we read, from verse 1, verse 3 coming down, verse 4 maybe coming down, everything that we read so far can apply to the time of the end, can apply to our day. And I believe that it has this secondary application to our time. I say secondary, I mean the fulfillment might be stronger in our day. But Jesus gave the prophecy in such a way that it would apply to his time, people who were listening in his day and who lived for the next 40 years afterwards. They would see these things being fulfilled, and they would remember the words of Jesus, and they would take these as evidences that what he was saying was coming to pass. We today take the same prophecy and we look at these events and we see them happening in our time, and we can apply it in a similar way. It's not misrepresenting or misunderstanding the Bible. It's understanding that the Bible is written with two different periods in mind, or Jesus gave the prophecy in such a way that it applies to two different ages of time. One of them on a small scale, the other one on a great global scale. Same events, same principles. And Jesus deliberately designed it like this. So now, he comes to something where you can see that he clearly is pointing to his age, the age of the apostles. Because look at what he says in verse 15. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. All right? Anybody who is reading this, please understand what I'm saying. That's what he's saying. Now, he says there's going to be something called the abomination of desolation. And it was going to be, it had been spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now, Jesus tells you a little bit more about it and says, this thing is going to stand in the holy place. This thing called the abomination of desolation was spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And Jesus said that the disciples, his apostles, they would see it standing in the holy place. And then he cautioned that the person who is reading, anybody who is listening, reading the book of Daniel and hearing what I have to say, you need understanding. In other words, it's not something superficial that you can just look at it and immediately work out what it's talking about. So this abomination of desolation is interesting. And I think we have spoken about it before in the webinar, but it certainly would take time to go into it this evening. So I won't go into it this evening. I'll just mention it in passing. So Jesus said it would stand in the holy place. And I'm going to do something here now, just to help us to understand what this means. Let me, I'm going to unlink it. Let me look for the link. And in the book of Luke, no, that's not what I want. In the book of Luke, it tells you a little bit more about this abomination of desolation. Luke 21 and verse 20. All right, in the right panel. Luke 21 and verse 20. Now, Luke 21, let me tell you, it's the same passage. It's the same experience. It's the same Jesus telling them, giving them the answer to their question. The same thing recorded in the book of Luke. All right, so I'll show you that it's the same thing. On the left, in Matthew, it says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. In the book of Luke, it says exactly the same thing. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. So it's talking about the same thing. Something is going to happen that is going to require people to flee to the mountains. What is it? According to Matthew, it is when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. According to Luke, it's when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies or surrounded by armies. Then you will know that the desolation of it is near. Notice Luke uses the word desolation, but he doesn't refer to the abomination of desolation. But it's the same thing they're talking about. It's the same event. It's the same story. Same narrative that Jesus spoke. But somehow Matthew referred to it as the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, and Luke referred to it as Jerusalem surrounded with armies. What we can conclude is that Jerusalem being surrounded with armies is the same thing as the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. So when the armies of Rome, the Romans, stood in the holy ground close by Jerusalem, then that was the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Like I said, we won't go into it in depth this evening. I'm just passingly mentioning it. What I'm looking at is that it's very clear that this is not speaking about our day. Because it says in verse 16, then let them which are in Judea flee into the mountains. Surely that does not apply to you and me. We are not in Judea. This is talking about something that will cause for people to flee physically and literally. They were to get up and they were to run. This is referring to people who are in a particular location, a particular geographic location. 1 second. So it's these people who are in Judea that are being focused on here in this passage. Now, again, I will say, and I think all of us are aware of it, that this also has a second application. Okay? There is something that is to happen in our day, and it will be a reflection of what happened back there. But when Jesus gave the prophecy, what we need to understand is that he was speaking primarily of something to happen in Judea. So the Christians in Judea, what they were to see that the Roman armies came into close proximity to Jerusalem, the holy ground surrounding Jerusalem. The Roman armies came there, and when they came in, God's people were to see that this was the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. And the first chance they got, they were to flee from Jerusalem. Now this actually happened because the Roman armies, led by somebody named Cestius, they came and surrounded Jerusalem. But because of something that was happening in Rome, they had to abandon their attack against Jerusalem. They had to turn away. And the Jews came out of the city and attacked them from the rear and did a lot of damage. The Romans left. And the Christians who were in Jerusalem at that point, as soon as this happened, they had their opportunity. And they quickly fled from the city of Jerusalem. I understand that most of them went to a place called Pella, another city many miles away called Pella. So the Jews were in triumph that they had defeated the Romans. But a few years later, a couple of years, the Romans came back led by another Roman general named Titus. And this time, they completely surrounded the city. They besieged it. They would allow no food to get in, nobody to get out. the terrible famine conditions came upon Jerusalem, where people began to sell donkeys for meat, donkeys' heads, rats, even eating their leather sandals in order to survive. And of course, Jerusalem was destroyed. The Roman armies came into Jerusalem and completely destroyed it. And Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled, which said that there would not be one stone left standing on another. They tore down the temple itself because, it was plated with gold on the inside. There was gold that had covered the walls. And in an effort to get at the gold, the Roman soldiers completely tore it down. And Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled. Not one stone shall be left standing on the other. Now, Jesus was careful to tell his people how to respond when that happened. And this is this is a very clear indication that this prophecy, it applies primarily to the people who were actually in Jerusalem or in Judea back in those days. Because Jesus says clearly in verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee into the mountains. So it's specific instructions to people in a specific place. This prophecy is not applied to us in the first instance, even though we will see that in a secondary way, it definitely applies to us. So he says, when that happens, look at how urgent they were to be. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And even though the Romans didn't come back until a couple of years later, I think the reason why Jesus gave them such a sense of urgency to tell them to get out immediately is because I think that if they had stayed in the city, even for a few days, if they had stayed back, they would have become trapped again by the city life. It's kind of like it's a lesson that needs to be reinforced again and again. When you hear of something happening and you don't act on it, usually after a while, the sense of the need to do something, it disappears. Whether it be that you hear a certain truth and you need to go out and share it, or whether it be that you hear that there's I myself am guilty of it, but I see an example of it all the time in Jamaica. You hear that every year, there's a hurricane coming. Sometimes one is really coming, sometimes it's not true, or sometimes it turns away, I should say. And we have seen that over and over, to the point where, the first time I ever saw a hurricane that hit the island directly was in 1988, and I was born in 1952. So it was when I was 30-something years old, nearly 40, before I saw a hurricane. And yet every year we have had predictions of hurricanes. We had some that passed by, and the tailwinds might have hit the coast and caused a little damage, but never did we have a real hurricane hitting the island fully until I was in my 30s, 1988. And what is interesting is that since then I've seen there have been two other direct hits. There was Gilbert, then there was Ivan, then there was Dean. Last year we had one that brushed us a little bit too. But what I'm saying is, I see every year they say there's a hurricane coming, and there's always the alarm. You are to board up your windows, you have to collect water, you have to make sure you have batteries and everything. They give you all the warning. And I guess I'm like a lot of people. I don't pay any attention to it at all, unless when it's about a day or two away and you are certain it's going to hit, then you start to take it seriously and you start to try to do something. And it seems like carelessness, but I justify it by the fact that I'm 72 years old, and if every year they come with this alarm, I have to go out and buy plyboard to board up the windows. Well, I guess I could buy some 1 year and just have them put down. I don't have anywhere to store things like that. If every year I have to go out and buy supplies and store every year, I mean, it would be tedious, it would be expensive, and it would be every year like a false alarm. 90% of the time, 95% of the time, it would be a false alarm. So it becomes the more you hear of something, the more you put it off, the more you become settled in your way of doing things. That's what I'm trying to say, and maybe my example wasn't a good example, because what I really wanted to say was that if when the alarm came, those disciples had decided to stay in Jerusalem for a day or two, by the third day, they would have gotten comfortable again. You see, my illustration wasn't really a good one, but they would have become comfortable again, and after they noticed that 6 months passed and there was no sign of the Romans, they would have settled down to business and life as normal, so that when the Romans came back in 2 years' time, they would have been completely unprepared. That's why Jesus told them to leave immediately, because he was thinking of their well-being. Because when they left immediately, they went away, established themselves somewhere, then they were out of harm's way. When the Romans came back, if it was even 2 or 3 years later, it was the disciples at that time were out of harm's way. So as you can see here in verses 17 and 18, Jesus tells them to move rapidly. Once they see what is coming, move rapidly. And that's where he says, woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. So, of course, again, this applies to people who are physically fleeing, people who are running. In our days, in my honest opinion, our aim is not so much physical preservation. It's very unlikely that in our day, our safety lies in physically fleeing to mountains. Okay? Even in the days of the apostles, what they did was they fled to another city, a place called Pella. They didn't actually run away to the mountains. I mean, when Jesus says, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains, they didn't actually go up in the hills and hide in caves. They actually went to another place, another town called Pella. But it probably was in the mountains. So what Jesus meant was that they were to put themselves in places where they were out of the way of the Romans. And in a similar way, I don't believe that our safety in these last days or at any time would consist of running away to live in the bushes. Because, that first of all, there's no place you can go today if people really want to find you, that they can't find you. And worse, if there are many of us, because you can imagine that we are talking about Christians. And there are, even though relatively speaking we are few, but there are a number of us. I mean, families, groups, church groups, and you'd have, we, for example, who live on an island, where in the island can many groups of people find to live up in the hills and to live off the land? So what I'm saying is, I don't believe that our safety lies in physical fleeing from one place to another. I think that our safety lies in having a relationship with Christ where we are depending on Him, living in close connection with Him, and hearing what He has to say to us moment by moment. Now, in verse 21, here's a very, should I say difficult? It's not really difficult, but in a way, it can be confusing. For Jesus says, pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. So why the verse is a little confusing if you take it superficially. Why? Because you are thinking, is this talking about the end of time, or is it talking about the time of the destruction of Jerusalem? Well, all of the verses from here coming down make you believe that you are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So you have to say that verse 21 is also referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus said it would be tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world and would never again be. So what are we to believe? Do we believe that there's coming a great tribulation, like the book of Daniel says? It says in Daniel chapter 12 that at the end of time, there will be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. Now Jesus is speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and he says it will be great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world and never again would be. So how can we reconcile those two things? Well, here's what I will say. Jesus was speaking to the Jews. And it is true that as far as the Jews were concerned, there was never such a great tribulation, and there will never again be such a great tribulation. You know, Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem hundreds of years before and carried away many of the Jews as captives to Babylon. Hundreds of thousands of them had been slain in battle. But this was not as great as what happened at the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. This destruction by the Romans was greater than anything that had ever happened to them before. Because it is said, historians say, I think it is the historian Josephus, I think it is he who calculates, I don't want to misquote him, but that over 1 million Jews perished. Over 1 million Jews perished in the destruction of Jerusalem. When the Romans attacked the city, it was at the time of the Passover, and the Jews had come from all over to come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And when they were attacked by the Romans, all of them were inside the city. So the food supplies that they had ran out quickly, and they began to starve. Famine conditions came upon them rapidly. And if anybody tried to escape, the Romans would capture them and crucify them outside the city as a way of encouraging those inside to surrender as fast as possible. It was said that there were hundreds of crosses outside the city with dead bodies hanging on them. So when they actually overcame the city, they actually slaughtered over 1 million of the Jews. It was said that water ran in the gutters, blood ran in the gutters like water. It was really the greatest tribulation that had ever come upon those people. And I don't think there will ever again be a single incident where something like this happens, where so many people are slaughtered at one moment that there 1 million people die in this kind of butchery where water runs in the gutters, blood runs in the gutters like water. So there have been cases since, like during the 2 world wars, for example. I understand that maybe about over 100 million people died in World War I and World War II. But this was conflict between the nations, events of war. And a lot of people that died in the wars were soldiers, people who were actually fighting. It was not like one side just massacred the other side and just slaughtered people willy-nilly. For the most part, it wasn't. And it wasn't as bad as what happened in Jerusalem. So Jesus said it would never again be. Now we know that at the end of time, there's coming a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. God's people are going to come out of the great tribulation. In some way, it's going to be greater than what happened in the destruction of Jerusalem. But in some way, it's not going to be as bad. And that's a kind of paradox. But I guess we have to wait until we actually experience that great tribulation to see how it can be worse in one sense and not as bad in another sense. Maybe because it is on a worldwide scale, maybe that is what will make it the greatest tribulation. But maybe it won't be as great because the slaughter will not be as terrible. So I'm just speculating about that. But anyway, primarily, this prophecy is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And see, Jesus says in verse 22, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Now, I'm going to stop at verse 22, and we will complete the passage next week, because there are some things I want to say that will take a little time, and I know we only have about 4 minutes left, just enough time to greet everybody. But we have stopped at verse 22, where Jesus says that in this great tribulation, the days will be shortened, because unless that happened, no flesh would be saved. Everybody would die. And maybe he meant all flesh among his people. Now I'm going to say something here that I will expand on next week. I think this great tribulation is speaking of 3 different times in the history of the people of Christ. 3 different times. One prophecy that covers 3 different great events. Event number 1 was the great trouble that came upon the Jews in the destruction of Jerusalem. That was the first fulfillment. The second fulfillment, I believe, was the great tribulation that took place during the Dark Ages, when it is estimated that over 60 to 100 million Christians died from persecution. That was another great tribulation of a different nature. Not a different nature, but the circumstances were very different from the destruction of Jerusalem. And then the third application is at the end of time, when God's people face that last great time of trouble. Why would I take the one passage and apply it to 3 different times? Well, next week I'm going to explain why. We can look at the context and see that it has to be applicable to 3 different times. But as I said, we will look at that in greater detail next week. Our time today is just about up, and we don't have enough time to look at it. So we will stop here for this evening. Just enough time to say thank you very much for joining me this evening, and God bless all of you for being here. I appreciated the presence of Sister Zadie, Brother Juan Carlos, Sister Helena, Brother Oliver from Ghana, Sister Sharon and Sister Zem, Sister Destiny, Brother Florian, Brother Kip, Sister Anita, Sister Angela, Brother Colin. That's Brother Colin from Trinidad. There's another brother from America named Colin too. Sister Vesna, Sister Arthea, Sister Beth, Brother Patrick, Brother Elton, Sister Chris, Brother Matthew. Good to have you this evening, Brother Matthew. Brother Matthew joined us Sabbath for the first time. Here he is again. Good to have you with us, Brother Gomedi. Brother Matthew. Brother Michael from Germany. Sister Teresa. And also Sister In the Name of the Truth. Those names always have me in a spin. I can't quite figure out who is this, but it's good to have you. Sister Kathleen. Sister Sonia, Sister Dario, Brother Matt, Sister Janet, Brother Bikang, Sister Nikki, Sister Pam, Sister Marjorie, our friends from Serbia, Evangeli, I think it's Brother Dragan, and from Slovenia, Christus of Evangeli. All right, blessings. Brother Flavius, greetings, and the other Brother Colin, blessings. Canadian Contrarian,